A few years back at TechOn 17, our language and interpreter session had a section on native JavaScript events in the BBJ HTML view, where we demonstrated integrating the full calendar library in a BBJ program. That demo was pretty exciting at the time, despite its limitations, as it showed that it was possible to leverage a mature JavaScript library into a BBJ application. But it was more of a proof of concept, since it only exercised a couple of the full calendar's capabilities, and it largely ignored all of the library's configuration options, as well as the numerous event callbacks available. That demo, along with the desire to have a robust calendar control available in BBJ, prompted Basis to commit to writing a calendar plugin to be released with BBJ 21. It can be thought of as the second in a series of plugins that use pre-existing JavaScript libraries in the BBJ HTML view control, where the first was Basis Europe's BBJ Grid EX widget. While the project is still very much a work in progress, the new plugin is very capable, so let's take a look at what it can do. Under the covers, the BBjCalendarWidget uses the full calendar JavaScript library. This library is open source and free to use, even for commercial products. It's actively maintained and still undergoing constant improvements, which is impressive given that it was first created in 2009. The BBJ plugin code is a set of BBJ custom classes that make it easy to add a functional calendar to a BBJ program, in as little as one line of code. Other BBJ classes give developers the ability to customize dozens of calendar configuration parameters, handle calendar events with traditional callback syntax, and define calendar entries or appointments. Developers can programmatically add and remove calendar entries, as well as execute custom code after the user interacts with the calendar and its entries. To show what the plugin is capable of, we'll launch a few demo programs. The first is very simple, as it just creates a BBJ window and then adds a BBJ calendar widget to that window via this one line of code. Running the program displays a fully functioning calendar, showing today's date, in a grid view. Although we haven't added any entries to the calendar yet, we can still navigate backward and forward to different months and years, as well as change the view type. The second demo builds upon the first by adding entries to the calendar, but it must first set a callback so that it's notified when the calendar widget has completed its initialization and is ready for interaction. We accomplish that with the following callback code. With this callback in place, the BBJ calendar widget will execute our custom code in the onCalendarReady subroutine. The code adds 3 entries to the calendar. First, an all-day entry for today that has a red background. Second, a timed entry for today that runs from 3 p.m. till 5:30 p.m. and uses default colors. Third, a multi-day entry starting tomorrow that runs for 2 days and uses custom colors. Now that we have entries on the calendar, as a user, I can modify the entries by dragging them to a different day or extending the duration for an event by dragging its edge. The third demo also starts off with a basic calendar, but instead of adding individual entries on the calendar, this program retrieves entries from the internet. The code in the onCalendarReady subroutine adds 3 entry sources to the calendar. 1, a web service that provides entries in a JSON array. 2, a public Google Calendar for weather conditions, and 3, a public Google Calendar for moon phases. When we run the third demo, we end up with a calendar filled with multiple events. And since we registered a callback to handle the user clicking on an entry, we can now see some of the details associated with an entry just by clicking on it. The fourth demo changes things up a bit by first creating a calendar options object, customizing several of the options, and then instantiating the calendar with these custom options. The most dramatic difference is that we applied a theme to the calendar by choosing one of the provided Bootstrap themes. But we've made other changes as well, including setting the initial view to a weekly time grid, turning on week numbers, changing the default entry colors, and making all of the entries editable. We can modify the calendar entries in a number of ways, including dragging an entry to another day, and dragging an entry's starting or ending edge to change its duration. The fifth demo reads in data from a comma-separated value file via the getResults.csv BBJ built-in store procedure. In the SQL fetch loop, it creates a new calendar entry object based off of the line data and adds it to a BBJ vector. After it has completed reading in the entries, it adds them all to the calendar by passing the vector of entries. The previous demos added entries one by one to the calendar, but this demo speeds up the process by adding all the entries at once. Instead of having the calendar take up the full BBJ window, this time the window is split vertically with the command palette on the left and the calendar control on the right. The left palette contains a dual set of checkbox entries corresponding to all the tags associated with the entries. Calendar entries support any number of custom tags that you can make use of later. To illustrate how tags can be used, the demo is set to dynamically hide or show events when the user checks or unchecks a checkbox for the tag in the top visible tags or the bottom hidden tags section. To begin with, none of the checkboxes are selected, so the calendar defaults to showing all events. By checking the exercise visible tag, we've instructed the calendar to only display entries with the exercise tag. We can make more entries visible by checking the webinar tag. After unchecking both of those, the calendar reverts back to displaying all the entries. We can then take the opposite approach and instruct the calendar to hide specific entries, such as those with the programming tag. By toggling that tag's checkbox, the calendar will hide and then show the entries with that tag, the big programming entry at 2 p.m., as well as the 8 a.m. webinar covering writing effective code. In addition to adding tags to the entries, this demo also adds group IDs. This means that we can work with all entries that match a particular group ID by modifying one of the group's entries. To see this in action, we'll first switch to the weekly view. All of the morning weightlifting entries share the same group ID, so I can modify all of them at once by changing the duration and/or starting time. This demo also reports on all of the available entry information whenever you click on a calendar entry. So clicking on a weightlifting entry displays a BBJ message box filled with a prettified JSON representation of the calendar entry, as well as everything contained in the actual calendar entry click event object. In the calendar entry definition, we can see that its group ID is set to weights, as are all the other weightlifting entries. This last demo shows another way to fill up a calendar with entries. In this case, we're adding entries from a BBJSP web service that scrapes entries from the New York University's public calendar. It looks like they have several entries dealing with streaming Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol. We can alt-click on the entry to open up the NYU event page, which shows that it features Tony winner Jefferson Mays and costs $50 to stream the event. When we view the calendar entry details in our BBJ app, we can see that this same information is stored in the entry's description, and it has further details in its extended properties, including a URL to a thumbnail image for the entry. Even though the BBJ Calendar widget isn't yet code complete, it allows BBJ developers to add a functional and configurable calendar to their BBJ applications. It gives developers the opportunity to add, modify, and remove calendar entries from a variety of sources, from singular entries to Google Calendars to web services. And when the developers register callbacks, their code will have the opportunity to honor or veto user changes to the entries, save updated entry information back to the source, and more. So that's our first look at the new BBJ Calendar widget that's targeted for release with BBJ 21.